She asked when the wedding was and her son-in-law said, "We got married last week." Marianne set her favorite china teacup down on the coffee table with trembling fingers, the delicate clink echoing through her daughter's living room like a warning bell. The floral pattern, roses and forget-me-nots, seemed to mock her now. How fitting. She'd been forgotten, all right. The afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor where she'd helped install just 2 years ago. Back then, Dawn had hugged her tight, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom." The memory tasted bitter now. Marianne had arrived with excitement bubbling in her chest like champagne. Wedding planning. Her daughter's big day. Finally, after all those years of struggle, something beautiful to celebrate together. She'd even stopped at the bakery on the way over, picking up those little lemon squares Dawn loved as a child. "So," Marianne had asked, settling into the familiar worn armchair that had been her spot during countless visits, "when's the wedding? I know you and Connor have been so busy with planning, but I haven't heard any concrete dates yet." The silence that followed should have been her first warning. Connor, tall, confident Connor with his perfectly styled hair and designer polo shirt, looked up from his laptop. His expression wasn't sheepish or apologetic. It was indifferent, like she'd asked about the weather. "Oh, we got married last week," he said, his voice carrying the same casual tone one might use to mention picking up groceries. "We just invited a few people who were important and close to us." The words hit Marianne like ice water thrown in her face. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The teacup, her grandmother's china, the one she'd brought to make this moment special, suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Important and close to us. The phrase echoed in her mind, each word a tiny blade cutting deeper than the last. She watched Connor's fingers continue typing, completely unbothered by the bomb he'd just detonated in her chest. Dawn sat curled up next to him on the couch, her legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone with the same detached air. Neither of them looked at her. Marianne's vision blurred slightly at the edges. 23 years. 23 years of being Dawn's anchor, her protector, her cheerleader, her bank account, her shoulder to cry on. 23 years of birthday parties she couldn't afford. Christmas mornings spent watching Dawn's face light up over gifts Marianne had sacrificed meals to buy. Graduations where Marianne beamed with pride from the audience while Dawn's father was nowhere to be found. Not important enough. The humiliation crept up her neck like rising floodwater. This wasn't just a private slight, this was public dismissal. Everyone who mattered to Dawn had apparently known about this wedding. Colleagues, friends, probably even acquaintances had been deemed more important and close than the woman who'd given birth to her. Marianne's hands began to shake, a tremor starting in her fingertips and spreading up her arms. She set the teacup down carefully, afraid she might drop it. The small action felt enormous, like lowering a flag of surrender. "Last week?" she heard herself whisper, her voice sounding foreign and far away. Dawn finally looked up from her phone, and for a moment, just a fleeting second, something that might have been guilt flickered across her features. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "It was just a small ceremony, Mom. Really intimate. You know how we are about big productions." Intimate. Another knife twist. Marianne remembered Dawn's sweet 16 party, the one Marianne had worked overtime for 3 months to afford. 25 guests, a DJ, a beautiful cake from the expensive bakery downtown. Dawn had called it the best night of my life, and hugged her mother until Marianne could barely breathe. That had been intimate too. That had mattered then. But now, sitting in this sun-drenched living room surrounded by furniture she'd helped pay for, wearing the pearl necklace she'd given Dawn for graduation, Marianne realized with crystalline clarity that she'd been living in a fantasy. She'd been playing the role of beloved mother, while Dawn had already written her out of the script. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself, it was the casualness of it. The complete lack of acknowledgement that this might hurt. Connor hadn't even paused in his typing. Dawn was already back to scrolling through her phone. This earth-shattering revelation that was rearranging the geography of Marianne's heart was just Tuesday afternoon conversation to them. Marianne stood up slowly, her knees protesting after sitting in shock for what felt like hours, but had probably been minutes. She smoothed down her dress, the blue one Dawn had always complimented, and picked up her purse. "Well," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Congratulations." The word felt like swallowing glass. As she walked to the door, Marianne caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked older somehow, like the last few minutes had aged her years. Behind her, she could hear Connor's fingers still clicking across the keyboard and the soft sound of Dawn's thumbs swiping across her phone screen. Neither of them called after her. Standing on the front porch of her daughter's house, Marianne felt something shift inside her chest. The hurt was still there, raw and throbbing, but underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt suspiciously like clarity. If she wasn't important enough to witness her daughter's wedding, then perhaps it was time to reconsider just how important they were to her. The afternoon sun felt different now as she walked to her car. Less warm, more revealing. It illuminated everything with harsh precision, including the fact that this betrayal hadn't been impulsive or accidental. It had been deliberate. Hey, my beautiful friend, hope you are doing well today. Drop a comment and let me know how you are feeling today and where you are watching from. Let me know how you are feeling about this story so far. If you're already feeling the sting of this betrayal right alongside Marianne, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep bringing you more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Marianne sat in her car outside Dawn's house for 10 minutes before she could trust herself to drive. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like a lifeline while 23 years of memories crashed over her in relentless waves. The beginning had been the hardest. Dawn was only 3 when Richard walked out, claiming he needed space to find himself. Apparently, finding himself involved a 22-year-old bartender named Cindy and a one-way ticket to Phoenix. Marianne never saw a dime of child support. She remembered that first night alone with Dawn, really alone for the first time since becoming a mother. 3-year-old Dawn had asked when Daddy was coming home, and Marianne had to explain through her own tears that sometimes daddies don't come home. Dawn had crawled into her lap and patted her cheeks with tiny hands. Don't be sad, Mama. I love you the mostest. The mostest. Marianne almost smiled at the memory, then caught herself. When had Dawn stopped loving her the mostest? Those early years blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and determination. Marianne worked the morning shift at the diner, then rushed to her afternoon job cleaning office buildings. Dawn spent her after-school hours at the diner, doing homework in the back booth while Marianne served coffee and forced smiles for tips that barely covered rent. Marianne's manager, Mrs. Patterson, used to shake her head. Maggie, you're killing yourself. That little girl needs her mama to take care of herself too. But what choice did she have? Bills didn't pay themselves, and Dawn's needs always came first. Always. When Dawn outgrew her winter coat, Marianne wore her threadbare one another season. When Dawn needed school supplies, Marianne skipped lunch for a week. When Dawn wanted dance lessons like the other girls, Marianne picked up weekend shifts and survived on coffee and determination. The sacrifices had felt purposeful then. Noble even. Every skipped meal, every extra hour worked, every personal dream set aside, it was all for Dawn's future. For her happiness. For opportunities Marianne never had. High school brought new challenges and bigger sacrifices. Dawn wanted designer jeans like her classmates wore, so Marianne learned to shop at thrift stores and alter clothes until they looked expensive. Dawn needed a car for her part-time job, so Marianne drained her savings account and bought a used Honda, then worked overtime to pay for insurance and maintenance. College was the biggest sacrifice of all. Dawn had dreams of studying art history at the State University, an expensive dream that would never pay for itself. Marianne remortgaged the house she'd finally scraped together enough to buy, working 3 jobs to cover tuition, room and board, books, and all the necessities that seemed to multiply each semester. I don't know how I'll ever repay you, Mom, Dawn had said during her sophomore year, tears in her eyes as Marianne handed over another check for unexpected expenses. I promise I'll take care of you when I graduate. Marianne had brushed away her daughter's tears. You don't need to repay me, sweetheart. Seeing you succeed is payment enough. What a fool she'd been. After graduation, Dawn moved to the city for an unpaid internship at a gallery. Of course, someone had to cover her rent and expenses while she built her network. Marianne sold her mother's antique jewelry collection, the one thing she'd planned to pass down to Dawn someday, to keep her daughter afloat during those crucial first months. Then Connor entered the picture. Connor, with his MBA and his family money and his casual confidence that everything would always work out. He swept Dawn off her feet with weekend trips to wine country and dinners at restaurants where Marianne couldn't afford to eat once in a year. Suddenly, Dawn's phone calls became less frequent. Their weekly dinners turned into monthly obligations, then sporadic meetups when Dawn had time. Marianne told herself it was natural. Daughters were supposed to build their own lives, find their own paths. But watching Connor slide effortlessly into the life Marianne had built brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, felt like watching someone else claim credit for a masterpiece they'd never touched a brush to. Connor never saw the nights Marianne stayed up until 3 a.m., holding Dawn's hair back while she threw up from her first heartbreak. He never witnessed the careful budgeting that made Dawn's childhood birthday parties possible, or the way Marianne stretched every dollar until it screamed. He never saw her eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so Dawn could have fresh fruit in her lunch. But somehow, Connor's opinion mattered more now. Connor's family traditions took precedence. Connor's idea of an intimate wedding trumped 20 years of Marianne dreaming about walking her daughter down the aisle, helping her choose a dress, being part of the most important day of her life. Marianne pulled into her driveway and sat staring at her modest house, the one she'd nearly lost twice keeping Dawn in college. The garden she'd planted was blooming beautifully. She'd had time to focus on it lately, now that Dawn didn't need her constant attention and support. Or so she'd thought. The irony was crushing. All those years, Marianne had believed she was building something. A relationship. A bond. A foundation of love and gratitude that would last a lifetime. Instead, she'd apparently been building a ladder for Dawn to climb up and away from her. The worst part was how easily she'd been erased. 23 years of devotion, and Connor could dismiss her importance with a casual sentence delivered without even looking up from his laptop. Dawn could nod along as if Marianne's decades of sacrifice were merely ancient history, irrelevant to their shiny new life. Marianne thought about her friend Linda, whose daughter called every Sunday without fail. Linda's daughter had insisted on postponing her own wedding by 6 months, so her grandmother could attend before her health declined further. That was what normal looked like. That was what love and respect looked like. This wasn't love. This was disposal. Marianne had served her purpose. She'd been the scaffolding that held Dawn's life together while she built something beautiful. And now that the construction was complete, the scaffolding could be torn down and forgotten. But scaffolding, Marianne realized as she finally got out of her car, could be repurposed. It could be used to build other things. Or, if necessary, to tear things down. As she unlocked her front door, Marianne felt something shifting in her chest. The grief was still there, sharp and persistent. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt less like sorrow and more like awakening. For 23 years, she defined herself as Dawn's mother. Dawn's supporter. Dawn's safety net. But if she wasn't important enough to witness her daughter's wedding, then maybe it was time to discover who Marianne was when she stopped defining herself by someone who clearly didn't value the definition. The house felt different as she moved through it. Quieter, but not empty. Peaceful, but not lonely. It felt like possibility. Marianne made herself a cup of tea in her own favorite mug. Not the good china saved for special occasions that apparently would never come. As she settled into her reading chair, she realized something profound. Sacrifices without gratitude weren't noble gestures. They were simply donations to people who'd learned to take them for granted. And Marianne was finally ready to stop donating to a cause that had forgotten her name. My dear friends, have you ever sacrificed everything for someone, only for them to forget it when it mattered most? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences helps more than we realize. Marianne didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from passing headlights sweep across the walls like searchlights, illuminating corners of her life she'd kept deliberately dark. Each memory that surfaced felt different now, as if someone had adjusted the lighting in a familiar room and revealed all the furniture was covered in dust. Dawn's 16th birthday party. Marianne had worked double shifts for months to afford it, her feet so swollen by the end of each day she could barely walk to her car. But Dawn had been radiant that night, spinning in her new dress, hugging her friends, posing for pictures with the expensive cake Marianne had splurged on. In the photos, Marianne stood in the background, exhausted but beaming. She'd felt so proud, so fulfilled. Now she wondered, had Dawn even noticed her mother's swollen feet? Had she seen the exhaustion Marianne tried so hard to hide? Or had Marianne simply been part of the backdrop, like the decorations that made the party beautiful but were forgotten the moment the event ended? The graduation dinner at Chez Laurent, Dawn's favorite restaurant. Marianne had saved for 6 months to take her there, wearing her one good dress and ordering the cheapest item on the menu while Dawn enjoyed the lobster. "This is perfect, Mom," Dawn had said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "I'm so lucky to have you." Lucky. Past tense, apparently. Marianne rolled over and stared at the framed photo on her nightstand. Dawn at her college graduation, diploma in hand, arm around her mother. Marianne remembered that day so clearly. The pride, the tears, the feeling that every sacrifice had been worth it. Dawn's future stretched ahead of them like a golden path. But futures, Marianne realized now, were destinations people reached and then forgot the roads that brought them there. The clock read 3:47 a.m. when Marianne finally got up. She padded to her kitchen and made coffee strong and black, the way she'd learned to drink it during those years when cream and sugar felt like luxuries. The familiar ritual was comforting, grounding her in the present moment. She sat at her small kitchen table and opened her laptop, the one she'd bought herself 3 years ago with money from her first raise in a decade. Connor probably didn't know that Marianne was perfectly capable of using technology. He probably assumed she was one of those helpless older women who needed constant assistance. Marianne pulled up Dawn's social media profiles, something she rarely did. Usually, Dawn called to share her news. Or used to call. The wedding photos hit her like a physical blow. Dawn looked radiant in a flowing white dress Marianne had never seen before. The ceremony had taken place in a beautiful garden, probably costing more than Marianne made in 6 months. Connor's family filled most of the frame, elegant people in expensive clothes, holding champagne glasses and laughing at some joke Marianne would never hear. There was Dawn's maid of honor, Jessica, whom Marianne had driven to the emergency room 3 times during high school when her own mother was too drunk to care. There was Dawn's college roommate, Amy, whose parents Marianne had housed for an entire weekend when they couldn't afford a hotel for graduation. People Marianne had helped, supported, welcomed into her home. People who were important and close enough to witness Dawn's wedding. But not her mother. Marianne scrolled through the comments. Dozens of congratulations, heart emojis, exclamations about how beautiful everything looked. Not one person had asked where the mother of the bride was. Either they all knew she hadn't been invited, or they assumed she'd simply been cropped out of the photos. Both possibilities made Marianne's chest tighten with humiliation. She closed the laptop and sat in the pre-dawn darkness, something crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on a window. This wasn't about the wedding. This was about 23 years of teaching Dawn that Marianne's needs, feelings, and dignity were secondary to everyone else's comfort. Marianne had trained her own daughter to dismiss her. Every time Marianne had swallowed her hurt when Dawn canceled their plans for something more exciting, she'd taught Dawn that her mother's time didn't matter. Every time Marianne had given money she couldn't afford without asking when it might be paid back, she'd taught Dawn that her mother's financial security was expendable. Every time Marianne had accepted being the last to know about important events in Dawn's life, she'd taught Dawn that her mother's feelings were an afterthought. Marianne had spent 2 decades being so grateful for any attention from her daughter that she'd never demanded the respect she deserved. She'd been so afraid of losing Dawn's love that she'd accepted less and less of it, until what remained barely qualified as affection at all. The realization should have broken her heart further, but instead, it felt like setting down a weight she didn't realize she'd been carrying. Marianne wasn't Dawn's mother anymore, not in any meaningful sense. She was Dawn's former caretaker, filed away with childhood toys and outgrown clothes. Useful once, but no longer relevant to the grown-up life Dawn had built. But that also meant something else, something that made Marianne sit up straighter in her chair. If she wasn't Dawn's mother in any real way, then she owed Dawn nothing. Not loyalty, not support, not endless forgiveness for behavior she'd never accept from anyone else. Marianne had spent so many years asking herself, what does Dawn need? That she'd forgotten to ask, what do I need? What did she need? She needed to stop checking her phone constantly, hoping for messages that came less and less frequently. She needed to stop declining social invitations because Dawn might call. She needed to stop planning her life around someone who'd clearly stopped planning theirs around her. She needed to stop being grateful for scraps of attention from someone who owed her infinitely more than scraps. Marianne rose from the table and walked to her bedroom window, watching the sky lighten at the edges. Dawn was coming literally and figuratively. For 23 years, she'd defined herself by her relationship to Dawn. Dawn's mother, Dawn's supporter, Dawn's emergency contact and safety net and biggest cheerleader. But if Dawn no longer wanted a mother, if she'd already replaced that role with Connor's family, Connor's approval, Connor's version of what mattered, then Marianne was free to discover who she was when she stopped organizing her entire existence around someone else's needs. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Marianne had spent so long being essential to Dawn's life that she'd forgotten how to be essential to her own. But she was only 51. She had time to remember. And if Dawn and Connor wanted to pretend that Marianne's decades of sacrifice were irrelevant to their story, then perhaps it was time for Marianne to make her own story. One where her needs came first. One where her dignity wasn't negotiable. One where being important and close wasn't determined by people who'd proven they didn't understand the meaning of either word. Marianne showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made her feel confident rather than invisible. She had things to do today. Phone calls to make. Plans to change. A life to reclaim. If she wasn't important to them, they would learn exactly how important she'd been by discovering what life looked like without her. The morning sun felt different on her skin as she stepped outside. Warmer. More purposeful. Marianne was finally ready to stop being someone's discarded past and start being her own present. The first test came 3 days later. Marianne was pruning her roses, a peaceful Tuesday morning ritual she'd recently begun to cherish, when her phone rang. Dawn's name flashed on the screen, and for a split second, her heart performed its old familiar leap. Hope, muscle memory, the ghost of 23 years of conditioning. But Marianne let it ring. She continued working with her roses, carefully removing dead blooms to make room for new growth. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. The phone fell silent, then immediately began ringing again. This time Marianne picked up, but her voice, when she answered, carried none of its usual eager warmth. "Hello, Dawn." "Mom." Dawn's voice was tight with frustration. "Why didn't you answer?" "I called twice." "I was busy." Marianne snipped another spent bloom, the sound sharp and final. "What do you need?" The question hung in the air. "What do you need?" Not "how are you?" Not "I'm so happy to hear from you." Not the careful dance of pleasantries Marianne had always performed to keep Dawn comfortable. Well, Connor and I are having some cash flow issues this month. The wedding was more expensive than we planned, and we're a little short on rent. I was hoping." "No." The word came out clean and simple, like breathing. Marianne surprised herself with how natural it felt. Silence stretched across the line. Dawn had clearly been prepared for the usual negotiation. Her mother's concerned questions, offers to help, the careful planning of payment schedules that Dawn would inevitably ignore. "No." Dawn's voice pitched higher. "Mom, it's just this once. Just until Connor's bonus comes through next month." Marianne almost laughed. Just this once. She could count at least 15, just this once moments over the past 5 years. The security deposit for their apartment. The car repair after Dawn rear-ended someone while texting. The credit card bill from their anniversary trip to Hawaii. Each time had been just this once, and each time Marianne had emptied her savings account a little more. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," Marianne said, her voice pleasant but distant. "You're both intelligent adults." "But Mom." "I need to go, Dawn. Have a good day." Marianne ended the call before Dawn could respond. Her hands weren't shaking this time. The phone rang again immediately. Marianne turned it off. 2 weeks later, the second test arrived via text message at 11:30 p.m. "Mom, emergency. Connor's car broke down and we're stranded at the grocery store. Can you come get us? My Uber app isn't working." Marianne read the message by the light of her bedside lamp. 6 months ago, she would have been dressed and in her car within minutes, despite the late hour, despite having to work early the next morning. She would have driven across town, helped them load their groceries into her car, probably stopped at the 24-hour auto shop to get an estimate on repairs. Instead, she typed back, "Sorry to hear that. Hope you find a solution." Then she turned her phone off and went back to sleep. The responses escalated quickly. Angry texts about being heartless and selfish. Voice messages where Dawn's voice cracked with indignation and Connor could be heard muttering in the background about ungrateful mothers. Marianne listened to each message once, then deleted it. The emotional blackmail campaign began in earnest during week 3. "I don't understand what's happened to you," Dawn said during a surprise visit that Marianne handled by answering the door but not inviting them in. "You're acting like a completely different person." Marianne stood in her doorway, not moving aside to let them enter. Dawn and Connor shifted uncomfortably on the porch, clearly expecting the usual automatic welcome. "Maybe I'm finally acting like myself," Marianne replied calmly. "This isn't you, Mom." Dawn's eyes filled with tears, a tactic that had worked reliably for over 2 decades. "You're the most caring, generous person I know. You've always been there for me. And you've always taken that for granted." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of shock across both their faces. Connor stepped forward slightly, his jaw tight. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone one might use with a difficult child. "I think you're overreacting to a simple misunderstanding about the wedding." Marianne turned her full attention to him for the first time since that devastating afternoon 3 weeks ago. Really looked at him. The designer watch, the expensive haircut, the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to choose between dinner and electricity. "Connor," she said, her voice perfectly pleasant, "you're not invited into this conversation. This is between my daughter and me." His face flushed red. "I'm her husband." "Yes, I gathered that from the wedding photos on social media. Lovely ceremony. I especially enjoyed seeing all the people who were important and close enough to attend." Dawn flinched. Connor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Now," Marianne continued, "unless there's something else you need, and I do mean need, not want, I have plans for this evening." She didn't have plans. She intended to make herself a nice dinner, read her book, and enjoy the silence of her own home. But they didn't need to know that. "Mom, please," Dawn tried one more time. "Can we at least talk about this? Can we come in?" "I don't think so," Marianne said. "I've realized that I've been too available for too long. It's made me take my own time and energy for granted, and apparently it's made you do the same." She stepped back and began closing the door. "When you're ready to have a conversation about respect, mutual respect, let me know. Until then, I think some space would be good for all of us." The door clicked shut with a sound that felt like finality. Marianne leaned against it for a moment, listening to their muffled voices on the other side. She could make out Connor's angry tone, Dawn's tearful protests. Part of her, the old part, the part that had been trained to fix everything and smooth over all discomfort, wanted to open the door and apologize. But a larger part of her felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. She made herself a beautiful dinner that night. Salmon with herbs from her garden, a glass of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, with classical music playing softly in the background. For the first time in decades, Marianne's evening revolved entirely around what she wanted. No phone calls to answer, no crises to solve, no emotional labor to perform for people who offered none in return. It was, she realized, absolutely delicious. The campaign against her intensified over the following days. Dawn left increasingly desperate voicemails. Connor sent emails about family loyalty and the importance of forgiveness. They tried to rally mutual acquaintances to intercede on their behalf. But Marianne had discovered something powerful. She didn't have to justify her boundaries to people who'd spent years ignoring them. Each boundary she maintained made the next one easier. Each no felt less like deprivation and more like self-respect. Marianne was learning that withdrawal of services wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. And consequences, she was beginning to understand, were the only thing that might actually teach two very spoiled people the value of what they'd so casually dismissed. The mother they'd taken for granted was gone. In her place was a woman who finally understood her own worth. And that woman was just getting started. Would you cut off family who betrayed you, or would you still help them out of love? Marianne was arranging fresh flowers in her living room when her sister Linda called, her voice unusually tight with discomfort. "Maggie, we need to talk." Marianne continued adjusting the gladioli she'd bought for herself that morning, bright yellow ones that made the whole room feel like sunshine. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Dawn called me yesterday." Linda paused, and Marianne could hear the careful diplomacy in her voice. "She's very upset. She says you've been acting strangely since the wedding." Since the wedding I wasn't invited to, Marianne thought, but she kept her voice neutral. "Did she mention why I might be upset?" "Well, she said there was some misunderstanding about the guest list, but Maggie." Linda's voice took on the gentle, patronizing tone people used when they thought you were being unreasonable. "Isn't it possible you're overreacting? Young couples today do things differently. Maybe she was just trying to keep costs down." Marianne set down the vase with deliberate care. Here it was, the first flanking maneuver. Dawn couldn't manipulate her directly anymore, so she was recruiting flying monkeys to do the work for her. "Linda," Marianne said quietly, "did Dawn tell you she got married last week and forgot to invite her own mother?" Silence stretched across the line. Then, more cautiously, "She said it was a very small ceremony. 27 guests, according to the photos. Including people I helped raise, people I housed and fed and drove to hospitals. But not me." Marianne's voice remained calm, but each word was precisely placed. Would you have found that acceptable if Mom had done it to you? Another pause. When Linda spoke again, her voice was smaller. I know. I wouldn't have. Then please don't ask me to find it acceptable either. The call ended soon after, but Marianne knew it was just the beginning. Dawn was building her narrative, painting herself as the victim of her mother's inexplicable cruelty. The story would spread through their extended family like ink through water, each retelling making Marianne seem more unreasonable and Dawn more innocent. She was right. Over the next week, Marianne received calls from her Aunt Ruth. Dawn is beside herself with worry about you. Her cousin Mike, maybe you should consider family therapy. And even Mrs. Patterson from the diner where she used to work. That girl loves you so much, honey. Pride isn't worth losing your daughter over. Each conversation followed the same script. Gentle concern for Marianne's mental state, subtle suggestions that she was being too harsh, careful omissions of exactly what Dawn had done to earn this response. Dawn had clearly mastered the art of positioning herself as the wounded party, while conveniently forgetting to mention the wound she'd inflicted. But Marianne was no longer the woman who crumbled under social pressure. She listened politely, provided the facts when asked, and refused to justify her boundaries to people who hadn't lived her experience. The real escalation came 2 weeks later. Marianne returned from her evening walk to find Connor sitting on her front steps, his face a mask of righteous indignation. She considered turning around and walking away, but something about his aggressive posture made her spine straighten instead. We need to talk, he announced, standing as she approached. No, we don't. Marianne moved toward her front door, keys already in hand. You're destroying my wife. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. She cries every night because of what you're doing to her. Marianne paused, her key halfway to the lock. What am I doing to her exactly? You're punishing her for having a small wedding, for trying to keep costs reasonable, for not living up to some fantasy you had in your head. The rewriting of history was breathtaking. Marianne turned to face him fully, and something in her expression made him take a step back. Connor, she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that precedes storms. Let me make sure I understand. Dawn's tears are my fault for being hurt by her actions, but her actions that hurt me are perfectly reasonable. You're her mother. You're supposed to love her unconditionally. I do love her, but unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional availability for people who've made it clear I'm not important to them. His face flushed red. You're being manipulative, using emotional blackmail to get attention. Marianne almost laughed. The projection was astounding. I haven't asked either of you for anything. I've simply stopped providing things you took for granted. She needs her mother. Then she should have treated her mother like she needed her. Connor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Let me be very clear about something. Dawn is my wife now. Our children, when we have them, will be my children. If you keep acting like this, you'll never meet your grandchildren. Is your pride really worth that? The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Marianne felt something cold settle in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was clarity. Let me be very clear about something too, she said, matching his whisper. Threatening me with access to hypothetical grandchildren is exactly the kind of manipulation that proves you learn nothing from this situation. And if you ever speak to me that way again, you'll discover that I have resources and options you haven't even considered. Something in her tone made him step back. Marianne unlocked her door and went inside, leaving him standing alone on her porch. But Connor wasn't finished. The whisper campaign began in earnest after that. Marianne started noticing the looks at the grocery store, the suddenly ended conversations when she approached groups at community events. Dawn and Connor were clearly working their network, spreading their version of events to anyone who would listen. Marianne's friend Carol mentioned hearing at book club that Marianne had had some kind of breakdown and was taking it out on poor Dawn. Her neighbor Janet asked with false concern if she was feeling okay after running into Connor at the hardware store, where he'd apparently shared how worried they were about her recent behavior. The narrative was insidious and effective. Marianne was an unstable older woman whose jealousy and mental health issues were tearing apart a young couple just trying to start their lives together. Dawn was the long-suffering daughter trying to help her unreasonable mother through a difficult time. The story conveniently omitted the wedding slight, the years of financial exploitation, the decades of one-sided emotional labor. It painted Marianne as the aggressor and Dawn as the victim, turning 23 years of history on its head. Marianne realized with crystalline clarity that she was witnessing a masterclass in gaslighting. They weren't just trying to get their financial and emotional support back. They were trying to rewrite reality itself, making her the villain in a story where she was actually the victim. But Marianne had lived through the actual story. She had the receipts, financial and emotional, to prove it. And she was beginning to understand that sometimes the only way to stop people from rewriting your history is to make sure the ending is written in permanent ink. The gloves apparently were coming off. That evening, Marianne sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, a legal pad, and 23 years' worth of financial records. If Dawn and Connor wanted to play hardball, they'd picked the wrong woman. Marianne had spent decades being accommodating, but she'd also spent decades being careful, thorough, and keeping very good records. It was time for them to learn the difference between someone who chose to be generous and someone who could be taken advantage of. The woman who'd raised Dawn might have turned the other cheek. But the woman Dawn had dismissed and Connor had threatened was done turning anything except pages in her favor. Marianne began making lists. Phone numbers, account numbers, documentation. If they wanted to make this ugly, she'd show them exactly how ugly it could get. My dear friends, if someone smeared your name with lies, would you defend yourself publicly or let the truth reveal itself in time? Let us know in the comments. Marianne's first stop was the law office of Patricia Hendricks, a family attorney she'd found through careful research. Patricia was known for being thorough, discreet, and utterly ruthless when protecting her clients' interests. I need to understand my legal position, Marianne said, sliding a manila folder across the polished desk. And I need to protect myself from further manipulation. Patricia reviewed the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every variety of family dysfunction. Bank statements showing years of loans that were never repaid. Receipts for tuition payments, car repairs, rent deposits. Text messages promising repayment, next month, dating back 3 years. Email threads where Marianne offered help and Dawn accepted without so much as a thank you. This is impressive record-keeping, Patricia said finally. Most people don't document their generosity this thoroughly. I was an accountant before Dawn was born, Marianne explained. Old habits. Lucky habits. Based on these records, your daughter owes you approximately $87,000 in unpaid loans. Did you ever formalize any of these arrangements? Marianne shook her head. She's my daughter. I trusted her. Patricia's expression softened slightly. Trust is admirable. Documentation is better. But we can work with this. She leaned back in her chair. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish? Marianne had spent 3 days thinking about that question. I want to protect myself legally and financially. I want to ensure that if they escalate their campaign against me, I have recourse. And I want them to understand that dismissing me was the biggest mistake they've ever made. Revenge. Consequences. Patricia smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. I can work with consequences. By the end of the meeting, Marianne had a clear plan. Patricia would draft formal demand letters for loan repayment, establish legal documentation of the debts, and prepare cease and desist orders if the harassment campaign continued. More importantly, Marianne would revise her will, removing Dawn and Connor as beneficiaries and establishing a trust that would donate her estate to educational charities upon her death. The beauty of this approach, Patricia explained, is that it's all perfectly legal and documented. They can't claim you're being irrational when you're simply protecting your financial interests and exercising your legal rights. Marianne's next stop was her financial advisor, Robert Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname. She'd been putting off this meeting for years, always prioritizing Dawn's needs over her own financial planning. I want to secure my retirement, she told Robert, and ensure that my assets are protected from people who might feel entitled to them. Robert reviewed her finances with growing concern. Marianne, you've essentially funded someone else's life at the expense of your own financial security. Your retirement savings are dangerously low for someone your age. The numbers were stark. While Marianne had been supporting Dawn through college, graduate school, and young adulthood, her own 401k had remained virtually stagnant. She'd cashed out investments to pay for Dawn's education, depleted her emergency fund multiple times to cover Dawn's emergencies, and delayed her own financial goals by decades. However, Robert continued, you still have time to fix this. If you stop the financial hemorrhaging and focus on your own future, you can have a comfortable retirement. They spent the afternoon restructuring Marianne's finances, moving money into protected accounts, setting up automatic investments. Most importantly, removing Dawn from all financial accounts where she'd been listed as a beneficiary or authorized user. What about the credit card I gave her for emergencies? Marian asked. Robert's expression was grim. She's run up a balance of $12,000 in the past 6 months. Mostly restaurants, shopping, and what appears to be a vacation to Cabo. Marian felt the familiar stab of betrayal, but this time it was accompanied by something else, cold, calculating anger. While she'd been eating peanut butter sandwiches to keep her grocery budget down, Dawn had been charging luxury vacations to her mother's credit card. Cancel it immediately. That evening, Marianne called her friend Linda back. I owe you an apology, Linda said before Marianne could speak. I talked to Mom about what you told me, and she reminded me of some things I'd forgotten. Remember when Dawn was 16 and crashed her car into the Hendersons' mailbox? Marianne remembered. Dawn had been texting while driving, something that would become a lifelong habit. The repair costs had been astronomical. Mom said you worked Christmas Eve that year to pay for the damages because Dawn spent her savings on those expensive boots she just had to have. And when Mrs. Henderson wanted to involve the police, you begged her not to press charges. I remember. Dawn told us last week that you'd never sacrificed anything meaningful for her, that you were just looking for credit for basic parenting. But Mom and I started adding up all the times you went without so Dawn could have what she wanted, and... Linda's voice trailed off. Maggie, we're on your side. Whatever you need, we'll support you. It was the first crack in Dawn's narrative, but Marian knew it wouldn't be the last. She began making strategic phone calls, not to defend herself, but simply to ask questions. When Cousin Mike called again to suggest family therapy, Marian asked, Did Dawn mention that she owes me nearly $90,000 and just charged a vacation to Cabo on my credit card without asking? When Mrs. Patterson expressed concern about Marianne's pride, Marian quietly inquired, Did Dawn tell you that I wasn't invited to her wedding because I wasn't important enough, but the people I helped raise were? Marian never argued or defended. She simply provided facts and let people draw their own conclusions. The effect was devastating. Within a week, the Whisper campaign began working in reverse. People started asking Dawn direct questions about her mother's version of events. They began noticing the inconsistencies in her story, the convenient omissions, the way she painted herself as perpetually victimized by circumstances beyond her control. Marianne's therapist, Dr. Amanda Foster, had been instrumental in helping her understand the psychological dynamics at play. You're dealing with classic narcissistic manipulation, Dr. Foster explained during one of their sessions. The wedding exclusion wasn't an oversight, it was a dominance display. They were establishing that they could treat you however they wanted without consequences. But now there are consequences. Exactly, and that threatens their entire worldview. Expect the attacks to get worse before they get better. People like this don't give up power easily. Dr. Foster helped Marian develop emotional armor against the ongoing campaign. Techniques for staying calm under pressure. Strategies for maintaining her boundaries without getting drawn into emotional arguments. Most importantly, she helped Marian understand that she wasn't responsible for managing other people's feelings about her choices. You spent 23 years training them to treat you as disposable, Dr. Foster said. It's going to take time to retrain them to treat you with respect. But the only way to teach people how to treat you is to stop accepting treatment you don't deserve. Marian also began rebuilding her social connections, reaching out to friends she'd neglected during the years when Dawn's needs consumed all her emotional energy. She joined a book club, started taking art classes, began volunteering at the literacy center. For the first time in decades, Marianne was building a life that didn't revolve around crisis management and emotional labor for ungrateful recipients. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who'd once jumped every time her phone rang now let calls go to voicemail. The woman who'd once planned her entire schedule around Dawn's potential needs now had a calendar full of activities that brought her joy. But Marian wasn't just rebuilding. She was strategically positioning herself for the battle she knew was coming. She documented every threatening phone call, every piece of malicious gossip, every attempt to manipulate mutual friends or family members. She built alliances with people who'd witnessed Dawn's behavior over the years, but had stayed silent out of politeness. She quietly gathered evidence of the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, the years of one-sided sacrifice that had been taken for granted. Most importantly, Marianne was discovering something powerful. When you stop trying to manage other people's emotions and focus on protecting your own interests, you become formidable in ways that surprise everyone, including yourself. Dawn and Connor had made a critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that Marianne's previous compliance meant she was weak. They'd mistaken kindness for stupidity, generosity for desperation. They were about to learn the difference between someone who chose to be accommodating and someone who'd simply been holding back her true capabilities out of love. The reckoning was coming, and Marianne was more than ready for it. The family reunion had been planned for months, long before Marianne's world imploded. Every year, the Chun extended family gathered at Linda's house for their annual barbecue. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and their various offspring sprawling across the backyard in a chaos of lawn chairs and paper plates. Marianne almost didn't go. The thought of facing Dawn and Connor in front of the entire family, enduring their performance of wounded victimhood, made her stomach churn. But Dr. Foster had been clear. Running away now validates their narrative that you're unstable and ashamed. Show up. Let them reveal themselves. So Marianne arrived at Linda's house wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with the delicate silver jewelry she'd bought for herself last month. She looked confident, composed, and utterly unshakable. The moment she stepped into the backyard, conversations died. All eyes turned to her, then quickly darted away. The awkwardness was palpable. Dawn and Connor sat at a picnic table surrounded by sympathetic relatives, Dawn dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while Connor rubbed her shoulders protectively. They'd clearly been holding court, sharing their version of events with anyone willing to listen. Marianne, Aunt Ruth approached with the overly bright smile people use when they're walking on eggshells. We're so glad you came. Dawn was just telling us how worried she's been about you. Marianne smiled serenely. How thoughtful of her. She moved through the gathering with quiet dignity, greeting relatives, complimenting Linda's flower arrangements, accepting offers of food with genuine warmth. She was the picture of mental stability and social grace. But she could feel Connor's eyes tracking her every move, his jaw tight with barely suppressed rage. The confrontation began, predictably, when Dawn approached her by the dessert table. Mom. Dawn's voice was pitched perfectly for the audience of relatives within earshot. I'm so glad you're here. We really need to talk about what's been happening. Everyone's so worried about you. Marianne continued serving herself a piece of Linda's famous apple pie. What specifically are they worried about, dear? Well, Dawn glanced around at their watching relatives, then back to Marianne with practiced concern. You've been acting so strangely since the wedding. Refusing to help when we needed you, hanging up on us, ignoring our calls. Connor and I have been wondering if you might be going through some kind of episode. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Episode. Code for mental breakdown, for instability, for dismissible irrationality. Marianne took a deliberate bite of pie, savoring both the sweetness and the moment. Then she looked up at her daughter with the kind of calm that precedes earthquakes. Dawn, are you suggesting that I'm having mental health issues because I stopped giving you money? Dawn's eyes widened slightly. That wasn't how she'd planned to frame it. It's not about money, Mom. It's about family. About being there for each other. I see. Marianne's voice carried perfectly across the suddenly silent backyard. And were you being there for me when you got married without inviting me because I wasn't important enough? A collective intake of breath from their audience. This was information Dawn clearly hadn't shared in her victim narrative. Dawn's face flushed. That's not, we explained that. It was a small ceremony. 27 guests, according to the photos on social media. Marianne's tone remained conversational, but her words cut like surgical instruments. Including Jessica, whose medical bills I helped pay in high school, and Amy, whose parents stayed in my house during graduation because they couldn't afford a hotel. And Connor's entire family, of course. Connor stood up from the picnic table, his face dark with anger. This is exactly what we're talking about. You're obsessing over details, twisting everything to make yourself the victim. Marianne turned to him with the kind of smile that made smart people take a step backward. Connor, I'm curious. In your version of this story, how much money do you think Dawn owes me? That's not. Money between family isn't. $87,000, Marianne said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the yard. In unpaid loans over the past 5 years. Would you like to see the documentation? The silence was deafening. Several relatives exchanged shocked glances. Dawn's face went pale. Mom, you said those were gifts. I have the text messages where you promised to pay me back. Would you like me to read them? Marianne pulled out her phone with the calm efficiency of someone who'd come prepared for war. Or perhaps we should discuss the $12,000 you charged to my credit card for your vacation to Cabo. The one you took while I was eating peanut butter sandwiches to keep my grocery budget under $50 a week. Connor stepped forward aggressively. You're manipulating the situation, taking normal family financial arrangements and weaponizing them because you didn't get your way about the wedding. Marianne's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made him stop moving toward her. Connor, she said quietly, would you like to explain to everyone here why you think it's normal for a daughter to exclude her mother from her wedding, then demand that same mother continue providing financial support? Because that's what mothers do. Dawn's voice cracked with desperation. They love unconditionally. They don't keep score. The words echoed across the yard, and Marianne felt something crystallize in her chest. There it was, the fundamental delusion that had poisoned their relationship for years. You're right, Dawn, Marianne said softly. Mothers do love unconditionally. But unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional service to people who've made it clear you don't matter to them. She looked around at their audience of relatives, all of whom were hanging on every word. I worked 3 jobs to put Dawn through college, Marianne continued, her voice steady and clear. I mortgaged my house to pay for her graduate degree. I gave her my mother's jewelry to pay for her first apartment. I've been her bank, her taxi service, her therapist, and her emergency contact for 23 years. Dawn was crying now, but they weren't the manipulative tears she'd been performing earlier. These were tears of genuine distress as her carefully constructed narrative crumbled. And when it came time for the most important day of her life, Marianne's voice grew stronger. She decided I wasn't worthy of witnessing it. But somehow, I was still supposed to be worthy of paying for her lifestyle afterward. Connor made one last desperate play. She's being vindictive. She's punishing Dawn for one mistake by destroying our marriage, our future, our ability to have children. I'm not destroying anything, Marianne interrupted, her voice cutting through his theatrics like a blade. I'm simply no longer subsidizing it. She turned to face the entire gathering, these relatives who'd been quietly judging her for weeks based on Dawn's manipulative storytelling. I spent 23 years proving my love through sacrifice, Marianne said clearly. I gave everything I had, everything I was, everything I dreamed of being. And when that still wasn't enough to earn basic respect and consideration, I realized that the problem wasn't my love, it was their entitlement. The backyard was silent except for Dawn's quiet sobbing and the distant sound of children playing in the front yard. Cousin Mike, who'd called Marianne multiple times to suggest therapy, slowly stood up from his lawn chair. Dawn, he said quietly, is what your mother saying true? You really didn't invite her to your wedding. Dawn looked around desperately, searching for allies in faces that had grown increasingly skeptical. It was complicated. It's a yes or no question, Linda said firmly. Did you invite your mother to your wedding? The silence stretched until it became an answer in itself. Uncle Robert, the family patriarch, set down his beer and looked directly at Connor. Son, I've been married for 42 years. Let me give you some free advice. The way you treat your wife's mother is the way you'll eventually treat your wife. And from what I'm seeing here, that doesn't bode well for either of you. Connor's face went white, then red, then white again. He looked around the yard, realizing that the sympathy they'd been cultivating for weeks had evaporated in a matter of minutes. This is insane, he said desperately. You're all letting her manipulate you with financial details and... The details matter, Aunt Ruth interrupted, her voice sharp with disgust. The details always matter. Marianne watched the shift happen in real time. The relatives who'd been viewing her with concern and pity were now looking at Dawn and Connor with something approaching revulsion. The truth had a way of recontextualizing everything, making months of manipulative behavior suddenly visible in stark relief. Dawn stood up shakily, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Mom, please. Can we talk privately? Can we fix this? Marianne looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and felt something she hadn't expected, sadness. Not for herself, but for the woman Dawn had become. Entitled, manipulative, unable to take responsibility for her choices or their consequences. Dawn, Marianne said gently, I will always love you, but I'm done being treated as disposable by someone who expects me to be indispensable. She picked up her purse and walked toward the house, her head high and her step steady. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of conversation starting up again, relatives asking pointed questions, demanding explanations, expressing outrage at behavior they'd previously excused. As Marianne reached the back door, she heard Connor's voice, high with panic. "This is all her fault. She's turning you against us." But no one was buying it anymore. The Emperor had no clothes, and everyone could see the truth at last. Marianne drove home in perfect silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in months, she felt truly at peace. The battle was over, and she had won it not through cruelty or manipulation, but through something far more powerful: the simple, devastating truth. 6 months later, Marianne stood in her newly renovated kitchen. Morning sunlight streaming through windows she'd finally had time to properly clean. The space looked completely different: fresh paint, new curtains, a small herb garden on the windowsill. It was amazing how much attention you could give to your own home when you weren't constantly managing other people's crises. The changes in her life had been swift and dramatic. Within a week of the family reunion, Dawn and Connor's social circle had collapsed like a house of cards. The truth had spread through their extended family and friend networks with the speed of wildfire. People who'd been sympathetic to their difficult mother narrative suddenly remembered their own experiences with the couple's entitlement and financial opportunism. Jessica, Dawn's former maid of honor, had called Marianne directly to apologize. "I should have said something when she told me you weren't invited because you were too dramatic for their vision," she'd said, her voice tight with guilt. "I knew it was wrong, but I didn't want to cause problems. I'm so sorry." Amy had been even more direct. "Dawn told us you'd become controlling about wedding planning, and they needed space from your interference. We had no idea you weren't invited at all." That's just evil, Mrs. Chun." The financial consequences had been immediate and devastating for the young couple. Marianne's lawyer had moved quickly once the family witnesses confirmed the deliberate exclusion and ongoing harassment. The formal demand for loan repayment had been served within days, backed by years of documentation and a clear paper trail of financial abuse. Dawn and Connor couldn't pay, of course. $87,000 was more than Connor made in a year, and their lifestyle left no room for savings. They'd been living paycheck to paycheck, supplemented by Marianne's generous loans that were never intended to be repaid. The credit card cancellation had been the final blow. Suddenly responsible for their own expenses, they'd been forced to move out of their expensive apartment and into a cramped studio across town. Connor's car had been repossessed when they couldn't make the payments. Dawn had been forced to take a second job waiting tables to make ends meet. Marianne felt no guilt about their financial struggles. For the first time in decades, she was able to build her own emergency fund, contribute properly to her retirement, and even take a vacation, a week in Tuscany that she'd dreamed about for years but never allowed herself. But the most satisfying changes weren't financial. They were social. The family dynamic had shifted completely. At Linda's birthday party last month, Dawn and Connor had arrived late and left early, sitting in a corner by themselves while relatives who'd once fawned over them now treated them with polite but distant courtesy. The charm offensive that had worked for years suddenly felt transparent and desperate. Meanwhile, Marianne found herself at the center of conversations, surrounded by relatives who wanted to apologize for being taken in by Dawn's manipulation and to hear about her new art classes, her volunteer work, her growing circle of friends who valued her for herself rather than her utility. "I can't believe we fell for their act," Cousin Mike had said, shaking his head. "But they were so good at making it seem like you were the problem." Marianne had simply smiled. Manipulative people are often very charming. That's how manipulation works. The most dramatic change came when Dawn showed up at Marianne's door one evening in November, looking haggard and desperate. Marianne almost didn't recognize her daughter. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a wrinkled uniform from the restaurant where she worked. Her hair needed styling, her nails were unpolished, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "Mom," Dawn said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." Marianne didn't invite her in. Instead, she stepped onto her front porch, closing the door behind her. The power dynamic was completely reversed from their last conversation. "I'm listening," Marianne said calmly. Dawn's voice broke. "I lost my job at the gallery. Connor's been having panic attacks about money. We can barely afford groceries. Our friends won't return our calls. Even his parents are asking questions about why my own mother won't speak to us." Marianne waited. She'd learned the power of silence. "I know I hurt you," Dawn continued, tears beginning to fall. "I know the wedding thing was wrong. But I didn't think. I didn't realize it would matter so much to you. You never seemed to care about that kind of stuff before. There it was, the fundamental misunderstanding that had destroyed their relationship. Marianne had been so good at hiding her own needs, so skilled at prioritizing everyone else's comfort, that Dawn genuinely believed her mother didn't have feelings worth considering. Dawn, Marianne said quietly, I cared about everything. Every milestone, every celebration, every moment of your life. I just never made my caring inconvenient for you. Dawn's face crumpled. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Please, can't we fix this? Can't we go back to how things were? And there was the heart of it. Dawn didn't want to fix their relationship. She wanted to restore Marianne's services. She wanted her financial safety net back, her emotional support system, her reliable source of unconditional giving. No, Marianne said simply. We can't go back. The woman you took for granted doesn't exist anymore. But I need you, Dawn sobbed. I can't do this alone. Connor and I are drowning. Marianne felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct, the urge to fix and rescue and sacrifice her own needs for her daughter's comfort. But she'd spent months in therapy learning to recognize that impulse as codependency rather than love. You're not alone, Dawn. You have Connor. You have your marriage, your career, your adult life. You chose to build those things without including me, remember? Now you get to maintain them the same way. Dawn looked up at her with desperate eyes. Are you saying you'll never forgive me? That I've lost you forever? Marianne considered the question carefully. I'll always love you. But the relationship we had before, where I gave everything and you gave back only when it was convenient, that's over forever. If you want a relationship with me now, it will have to be between equals. People who respect each other's time, feelings, and boundaries. I can do that, Dawn said quickly. I can change. Maybe you can. But Dawn, Marianne's voice grew firm. I won't be testing that theory with my wallet, my emergency availability, or my willingness to be treated as optional. Those days are over. Dawn left that night without the reconciliation she'd been hoping for, and Marianne felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace with a difficult decision. The final piece of revenge came in January, when Marianne received a wedding invitation that made her smile. Jessica was getting married, and the invitation was addressed to Mrs. Marianne Chun and guest. A level of courtesy and respect that her own daughter had never shown. Marianne RSVP'd yes, and bought a beautiful dress for the occasion. At the reception, she was seated at a table with other parents and family friends, treated with the honor and inclusion that should have been hers at Dawn's wedding. When Jessica's mother gave her tearful speech about the people who'd helped shape Jessica into the woman she'd become, she specifically thanked Marianne for being a second mother during Jessica's difficult teenage years. Marianne wiped away tears of joy, not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd found. A community of people who valued her. A life built around reciprocal relationships. A sense of self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval or neediness. Dawn and Connor weren't at the wedding, of course. They couldn't afford the gift, the outfit, or the time off work. More importantly, Jessica had made it clear that their presence wouldn't be welcome. As Marianne danced with Robert, Linda's husband, she caught sight of herself in the mirror lining the reception hall. She looked radiant, confident, free. The woman in that mirror had learned something invaluable. True love couldn't be bought with sacrifice, demanded through guilt, or sustained by codependency. True love was mutual respect, genuine appreciation, and the recognition that everyone in a relationship deserved to have their needs matter. Marianne had spent 23 years teaching Dawn that her mother's needs didn't matter. The lesson had been so thoroughly learned that Dawn genuinely couldn't understand why her wedding exclusion was hurtful rather than practical. But teaching someone to devalue you was a mistake that could be corrected. The correction just required something that many people found harder than continued sacrifice: the courage to demand better. Marianne had found that courage. And in finding it, she discovered something she'd forgotten in all those years of service. She was worth more than she'd been accepting. The sweetest revenge wasn't cruelty or punishment. It was simply living well, surrounded by people who recognized her value, free from the exhausting cycle of giving to those who saw generosity as weakness rather than gift. Dawn and Connor were still struggling, still learning to navigate adult life without their parental safety net. Marianne occasionally heard updates through family members. They'd moved again. Connor had started therapy for his anxiety. Dawn was working 2 jobs. Marianne felt no particular satisfaction in their difficulties, but she also felt no guilt. They were simply experiencing the natural consequences of their choices, learning lessons that most people figured out much earlier in life. As for Marianne, she was finally living the life she'd deferred for decades. Traveling when she wanted to. Saying no when she wanted to. Building friendships based on mutual enjoyment rather than utility. Dating, even, something she'd thought was impossible at 51. She'd learned that it was never too late to stop accepting less than you deserved. Never too late to demand respect from people who'd forgotten how to give it. Never too late to discover that the most powerful word in any relationship wasn't yes. It was no. And Marianne had finally learned how to use it. If you were Marianne, would you have chosen revenge or forgiveness? Sometimes the most powerful choice is neither. Sometimes it's simply choosing yourself for the first time in decades. What did you think of Marianne's journey? Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever had to set boundaries with people who took your generosity for granted. And if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. These tales of triumph take hours to craft, and your support helps us bring more stories of people who refused to stay victims.